Okay, ladies and gentlemen.
Nice to meet you. Want to slide down a bit?
We are going to start again.
There we go.
Is that good?
If you look at your agenda, this next item is our fireside chat. And you'll notice two things that may seem a little bit out of place. The first is there's no fire. We really wanted to do something like that, but apparently the Purdue fire marshal is not very keen on any of the ideas we had. So imagine there's a virtual fire up here. I am going to moderate the fireside panel. And the second thing you're going to notice that doesn't quite match the agenda is, unless she is a master of disguise, none of these people up on the dais here are Deb Franke. Deb was coming in very late last night, and we believe that she fell victim to this Midwest weather and the snow and ice that was coming in. So we have instead had a couple people volunteer to step up and add to the panel. And so, of course, from my far left, a new face up here, John Walsh, who's the president of Cypris Electronics, a CERIAS partner and somebody who's been working in this field for a long time, has agreed to serve on the panel. Sam Curry, you recognize, I hope, from the last talk. He is also a master of disguise, but chose not to exercise that today. And next to him, to his right, your left, is Dave Toomey, who's vice president of cyber at SRC Corporation, another CERIAS partner. And so the three of them have agreed to join with me for the fireside chat. And the way this will work is I've got a couple questions to start things off for them to react to. I'll be chatting with them about this as well. And then if the audience has some questions that you'd like to ask of the panel, you please line up here at the microphone in the center aisle, and I'll acknowledge you. And we may turn the mic on to get your questions. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. Is there an extra chair there? I was going to join you.
There's a few, actually, if you want to come up. We can scooch over.
Thank you.
Could have done like a video of a fire up on that.
Yeah, well, we had that at one point. The fire marshal didn't even like a virtual one, so.
Battery-operated candle.
Yeah. We'll have to see what we can do. If any of you are really missing the experience, there is hot sauce at lunch, so we can add that. I solicited from a number of the students and the staff some initial questions that could be addressed, and I got a wide range of them. One of the ones that I thought was most interesting is that we have a blurring of definitions as we go forward. The notion of what privacy is, for instance, has begun to blur because of social media and the things that we share with it. But we're also seeing a kind of a forced blurring because of intellectual property laws, where we don't necessarily own what we have, and vendors are able to get in to enforce rights or to observe licensing. And we also have governmental entities that want the ability to be able to monitor what's going on because of national security or law enforcement purposes. And that also threatens some of the definitions of ownership, of privacy, of boundaries. This trend seems to be accelerating. So the question for each of you to, any of you who want to respond to this is, how is that going to continue to change? Is there an end point to that? What do we do about it? Should we be concerned? Just your reactions.
I'll take a stab at it if you want. I don't know. So I think the most practical definition for security that I know, aside from the classic ones, is cost to break. What is the feasible cost to break given state of the art for any given security control? So I think an analog for that in privacy is cost to obtain information about someone. And there's many factors in there. Security is just one. For instance, it's much easier to get information on a celebrity than it is on a private citizen who's very conservative about things. And I think that over time, there's a commoditization curve in both of those costs. The cost to break things is declining, and the cost to obtain information about people is declining. And I think where we start to get into issues is when you want to raise that cost around specific information or types of information. And it's closely tied to the notion of intellectual property. The biggest fear that I have as an officer for a company is this notion of intellectual contamination, right? That once you get people in an idea soup, you can't tell whose idea is what. And so the notion of being able to protect, to create almost artificial boundaries, and then to raise the cost to obtain information about what's happening within it is, I think, becoming more and more challenging, is only going to continue that way. There's a great book, by the way, by David Brin called Earth. In it, he talked about how World War III would be a war over information privacy. And of course, it's science fiction, but it's a lot of fun. And of course, the society after this war is all about open access to all information. Privacy becomes an anathema.
He did a nonfiction book called The Transparent Society.
He did, yeah.
Which takes that idea to extremes, and it's very interesting reading for anyone interested in privacy.
Yeah, he's a deep writer anyway.
Go ahead.
So I grew up in the military for the first 25 years of my career, and we had this mantra of need to know, and we didn't share anything with anybody that didn't need to know. And if you look at the explosion of social, mobile, analytic, cloud, and you look at the millennial generation, I look at my kids, it went from need to know to need to share, right? Snowden's an interesting discussion there, right? Everybody feels this need to share, and so as somebody in a company, and you're bringing these people on as employees, and you start to look at intellectual property and you start to look at privacy, you've got to realize that the people that you're bringing in are very comfortable sharing everything they know with everyone. That's the first piece. The second piece is the whole BYOD thing from a company point of view, right? Bring your own device. When I start to invite employees in and I ask them to bring their own mobile devices, and now they have access to my IP and my privileged information on their device, as a company, now I've got to work through the trials and tribulations of how do I enforce that. And then the third piece I'll throw out is we tend to put everybody, we tend to mirror image everybody as ourselves when it comes to the rights and privileges to IP. There are other countries that don't feel that getting in and getting access to your IP and taking your thing and repackaging and selling it is against the law, whereas we do. And so all three of those things are being played out now in today's environment, which are really interesting from a company perspective.
Don, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was giving a briefing at Stanford Research Institute on identity. And we were talking about next generation methods to establish identity in the device and how we could metadata bind information to use the silicon as the root of trust in the device. And the big issue that came up, which surprised me, was this concept of privacy. Now that I can begin to establish identity to a absolute provable method, if you will, how does that affect the identity of the individual themselves, if you will, in terms of your ability to identify the individual's device? And so I kind of think there's also a little bit of a conundrum that we're going to be faced with, because some of the things that we need to do in order to provide security and protect your private information will also, if used in a different way, could be used to identify you and more specifically relating to your privacy. So there's, at some point, this is this gray area we're operating in, and we're going to have to, and I think the younger folks are more concerned about privacy today than I think at least the older generations are relative to what's happening online. At least that's my experience. They're starting to purchase crypto applications for emails and texts, and how do I protect my privacy online. So I think it's going to become more and more an interesting area to operate in.
Well, I think that's an interesting observation. There's an interest in privacy, but it is a different conception of privacy that many of us have held for a while. In particular, the mobile devices and the BYOD. I don't know the BYOD, by the way, is the best acronym, because many of the devices that we have, we don't actually, they're not ours.
Yeah.
They're owned by the vendor or whoever has put something on it. But more and more geolocation drives what we see, what we have, the information that we want to access, and that impacts elements of our privacy that we didn't have before.
The whole concept now of digital footprint. I mean, and where you're going, what you're doing, what transactions you're making, and how we're using big data now to pull that together in such a way that
Yeah,
it's a real privacy issue
others
there.
have a better view of you than you do.
That's right.
I think the other interesting thing that, especially the students in the room, if you look at the folks that are running a lot of these big companies and you look at the makeups of the board, most of those folks didn't grow up in the same, obviously, generation you did and don't have the same appreciation for the technology. So these kinds of discussions are not easy ones to have because you can quickly get way over their heads real fast. And so one of the challenges the folks coming out of the school or the university are going to have is how do you communicate with a group of folks that didn't grow up in the same space as you and help them understand what it is you're trying to say, or you're rapidly going to get stuck in the security box and go over there and patch the systems, I'll call you when I need you. Whereas we really need you folks to help educate these folks as to what the opportunities and risks are of these technologies. It's an interesting challenge.
But we're also moving away from a world with a one-to-one mapping of people to devices, or even a one-to-many, that you have a transitory footprint on some devices. So you become almost awake rather than a footprint, right, as you move among things that have a more intelligence than they had before.
Well, I'll say one way that I stay fresh is I refuse to grow up to date, so that helps. But let me add to this actually many-to-many kind of aspect. What most people don't know about, I heard it at a recent meeting of the Poneman Institute. There was a nice discussion. The vehicle-to-vehicle standard that's coming along, many of you may not have heard about this. This is mandatory that all automobiles will have basically a kind of near-field communications that they will network from car to car and possibly ground stations that are nearby. This is required. This is going to be required for safety purposes, for inter-car communication. But certainly a big motivating factor behind it is also advertisement. So that as you're cruising along down the highway, you'll be presented with
Chuck E. Cheese next right.
yes.
I'm hoping there's still a space for an anti-DDoS solution there.
Yeah.
We want to avoid cars being driven as packets off a bridge, right?
But it will do things for potentially will do things like take over your brakes if you're approaching too fast to another car.
Well, that already happens to some degree. I met with a couple of automotive CISOs, and they actually spoke about the human dimension being the main gate to what they do. They already charge the brakes. And you know the cars where you press the button and you touch the brakes as it parallel parks? Like, we don't need you to touch the brakes. It actually makes things worse.
Yeah.
But it's the creep factor. They had an over-under, I think it was 2017, they said, after which they thought it would be easier to introduce features where the car drives into the market, and then 2024, when it would just be expected. And an interesting thing will happen in the actuarial world, right? Before a certain date, if you take over the car and there's an accident, you could be sued. But afterwards, if you didn't, you could be sued.
Yeah. Well, same with planes and other things.
Yeah.
But one of the concerns that's brought up by this is these kinds of features that are being put in that not only know where we are, track our information, we don't even know what's being reported or to whom, as well as you know, taking over control. What do we as individuals have as recourse or say in how computing and communications is changing our control, our privacy, our autonomy, because the trends don't look good.
Well,
Go
ahead.
There's a lot of interesting issues, I think, that are surfacing that, quite frankly, I hadn't imagined. Things like drones. We're talking in Florida right now. We had an interesting event occur on the beaches where they're flying drones. And people complain that, I'm on the beach and they're flying a drone, and it's an invasion of my private space. So in Florida, 300 feet is considered, above your home. So as we start looking at implementing drones, are they going to fly down the streets? Are they going to fly beeline over homes? What's the right of privacy above your homes for these kinds of things?
Delivery, Amazon has
Right
certainly been hyping it up.
on the cars, right to repair. As we secure these cars from a cyber attack and we start to look at securing them in the sense that it has to be an OEM that can actually have the key or the access to the vehicle, there's a significant right to repair movement out there. So it's all kinds of interesting things that are starting to emerge around as we try to lock these things down, how people want to have the freedom to do what they want.
Well, there's a concern not only at the level of autonomy for the systems that are in place, but if we take that a step further, there's been quite a bit in the news of individuals expressing concern over the future of AI and its possible negative influence on those of us in meat space, to use the term. Any comments? I mean, you gentlemen are all involved at some of the forefronts of technology.
You know, it's interesting to watch the whole, the deep learning, the machine learning, the AI evolution, because it's unavoidable. I mean, we talk about, my last job in the Air Force, I was in charge of the Air Force's Blue Team, and we did assessments of other military installations and the posture of their cybersecurity. And at that time, we used to say that putting man in the loop was okay because the man could keep up with the pace of the data he was being asked to look at. And we've rapidly exceeded that capability. And it's hard for folks that are in that space to want to say that we need to take the person out of the loop and put them on the loop and let the machine start to make some of those decisions for us. And try to explain that to the 3-star general that Dave Toomey is no longer going to make the machine. K7 number 5 here will make the bulk of the machines, and the ones that K7 can't make, Dave Toomey's going to make. And that's where we are right now from a cybersecurity perspective. There's just too much data for people to sit in front of screens and make real-time decisions. You've got to be able to take that step back and let the machines make the 90% of those decisions and let the Dave Toomeys make the 10% decisions on those lows and slows, those stealth, those low observable things that the machines haven't been able to figure out yet. And that's going to be a big cultural mind shift for folks in the security space.
How does this fit with the customer-centric model?
But even short of AI, because we still haven't solved the Turing challenge, right? We're talking about more intelligence. I think that ultimately has to find the right balance between the carbon and the silicon. That is fundamentally why security departments are losing the race against attackers, because the attackers can pick the point of entry. And they're so effective that staying on top of all of that data is proving to be too much of a challenge. To answer your earlier question, though, because I think it's related to this, historically, we've had two options. You could either vote with your wallet by not buying something, and that's going away. Because if it's mandated as part of a standard for roads and every car has to have it, or are you really going to not have a smartphone in 10 years? I mean, or whatever succeeds it. Or you have to resort to democratic appeal and to processes. And I think it's really going to test some of our institutions to do that. The correct applications of AI, likewise, we have to find a whole new body of human law and societal norms, because it's coming fast. The rate of change is so quick, we're going to have to deal with this as a society. It won't be the subject of esoteric talks by security professionals. It has to be in the mainstream.
Well, when we're in at least in a U.S. society where the majority of people seem to believe in horoscopes, for instance, being able to make informed decisions on complex AI issues seems...
Oh, maybe your AI is Sagittarius or something, right? Or Taurus.
Could be writing those horoscopes, that's right.
Well, this was a problem in ancient Athens, right? I mean, the radical democracy of Athens also, that when people were ostracized in society and their names were written on stones, there were people there to help you write because not everyone was literate. So I don't think this is a new thing. This is the challenge of a democracy and something every generation has to reforge.
Well, it's sort of worrisome that you're bringing up a society that failed.
Well, the Delian League notwithstanding, and the Peloponnesian League, what is it about democracy? It's a terrible form of government, but it's better than all the rest. Nevertheless, that is what we have. But you raise an interesting point, because the point was made earlier about different mores in different cultures, and what is private is not defined the same way among cultures. Others will embrace AI. Others will embrace more, shall I say, more machine learning. And how are you going to, let's just pick a country, China or India. We're talking over 1 billion people, and they want motor cars, and they want them to be safe. I mean, if you've ever tried to drive in Mumbai, it's not fun, right? I mean, you rent a car, it hurts, and it comes with a driver for a reason. this is not scalable and not indefinitely. So to some extent, it's going to happen. The question is, to what degree will we do it, and to what degree will other societies with whom we interact do it? And what does that do for our diplomacy?
So, John, what is the idea of 1 million drones for you? Or 1 billion drones?
A million drone march or something, yeah.
Yeah, I think I kind of like looking up at the sky and being able to see the sun, you know. No, I think that that's going to present an interesting challenge. I think that we're heading off after this meeting to the Automotive Safety Council event in California to meet with Google Car. And as I'm listening to you talk, I think there's always a benefit versus the return, right? And I can say in the automobiles, active safety systems and the relating, you know, we gave a paper there last year and we talked about, are the systems that are making our cars safer, making them more unsafe due to the vulnerabilities that we're introducing for a cyber type of a threat. And without a doubt, that's the case. That being said, there's a significant improvement in the severity of crashes as a result of active safety systems. And so it's driving the implementation of these technologies. Google Car is coming. And so, you know, to your AI thought process, I think that in certain applications, obviously, there is benefits to having these systems. I think the big challenge is going to be while we're using them to make things safer, unless we address the cybersecurity issue, we're going to be providing more pathways in that folks can take advantage of in the cyber physical side, right?
Well,
to make them unsafe.
you raise an interesting question to me, and that is there's a problem. These systems provide a certain de-skilling. And Sam talked about people not being able to write on the whiteboard because they're so used to keyboards.
Find your way.
My car, I sort of have the bleeding edge of technology on occasion, has this anti-collision, auto-follow speed control. And on a recent trip, I had it engaged, and I crept up too close to a truck, closer than I thought it should have allowed. And suddenly, warning lights came up all over the screen, computer system failure, everything is disengaging. And in heavy traffic, it suddenly just cut out and started to slow down. The failure modes for these now, because we have people who are not accustomed to dealing with them, are more severe. That the crashes that will occur on planes or cars or others, because we no longer practice those skills. I still know how to work the brake pedal, so I guess that's a good thing. That's another issue that I haven't heard described very much.
My grandfather used to lament we weren't learning the times tables high enough anymore. That, you know, we really need to know up to 14.
Yeah, you go to like a McDonald's, if the register's down, they cannot make change for $1. That's pretty concerning. So that's another aspect. It's not simply AI, it's just simply I. We seem to have some issues there to address. I don't know.
But then again, if you look at a millennial, they pick up a device and they intuitively know how to use it, as many of the older generations don't.
Only if it has a processor in it.
We got to, in my previous life, I was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And so when you talk about vehicle-to-vehicle separation, the airline industry has the same challenge, right? You've got all these airplanes flying through a limited amount of airspace. How do you do it efficiently to save money, which saves time, which saves gas, which saves dollars, but you got to be able to do it safely, right? And so they have things like TCAS, right, which is supposed to keep airplanes certain distances away, and you put in rule sets. And the rule sets allow you to define the space and how close things are allowed to get. And then they overlay route structures and say, well, to keep things safe, if you're going this way, you can only fly at this altitude, that way at that altitude. And all that stuff works great in a nice blue sky.
And you put a million drones in it.
But then when you put 1 million drones in it and you land in Chicago and it's snowing and somebody's nose wheel got cocked so it stopped the flow on the ground, you know, at what point does the human take over for the AI, or the AI be able to navigate itself through that? And it gets really complicated really quick when you can't define a good rule set to keep things straight.
I guess the point that I was trying to raise there, and all of you have illustrated here, and worthy for us to think about, security is not the only feature that we should be concerned with. Safety, particularly in failures, whether they're caused by a hacker coming in from somewhere else or by the system itself not having the right parameters or having some short circuit can be equally damaging or maybe even worse to the customer that we should be including in the loop. And so we should be very concerned about safety as well as security as we go forward.
But, is it Thomas Street Payne, the society that chooses safety over liberty deserves neither? I think it was, wasn't it?
I thought it was Franklin.
It might be Franklin.
Give me liberty or give me death.
There we go. Either way. But it is incumbent upon us, and I think there's an opportunity for us as technologists to say we're going to adopt some principles about protecting liberty and privacy and trying not to do any harm to those principles. We will do no harm in the cost to obtain information about you in building X. We will make sure that you are in control of risk-based decisions to the extent that it's possible. If it's not, we're going to tell you. I mean, those are almost first principles that we have to inject into the process rather than just pure engineering processes. We have to say it matters for ethical and community reasons. Or we don't. We just move ahead at a breakneck pace.
I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I look at it from a company point of view. We were talking about this in the hallway earlier. You know, it's how do you take advantage of the Purdue graduate so that you bring them into the operational, on the mission side of what it is your business is or your capability is, so that you can actually help make it better for us. You know, one of the challenges I have is when we bring our security guys in, and you hit it on it earlier, is they always want to tell me what I can't do. And I don't want to know that. I want to know how I can do it better, do it safely, do it smartly, but I want to be able to do it. And one of the things that I would ask you that grow up on the defensive, on the security side of the house is, help me do what I want to do, but do it smartly. And that's a hard thing for folks, is they always want to come in, they want to do the links and nodes analysis of the 100 different places that this could break down, that hacker could get in. And pretty soon we can't do anything because everything is so insecure that it's not worth doing anything. And that's not what I'm looking for from
not
you folks.
doing it isn't an option.
That's not an option. Turning off the internet isn't the option. So I'm looking for you guys to help me figure out how to do it smartly. That's a hard thing.
If any of you would like to pose a question, come up to the microphone. And while I'm waiting on that, a question, we were actually thinking about having a panel on this idea. People talk about a cyber Pearl Harbor, and that is unlikely, but at the same time, we sort of have, I think the term was a cyber Attila the Hun. We have this constant hemorrhaging criminal activity. We don't need a cyber Pearl Harbor. It's ongoing over time.
This was my big concern over critical infrastructure stuff. I said, you know what, every time we've had, any society has had a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 or something like that, we rally as a society. We do, and we find ways of dealing with it. But cyber crime has been shorting stock and manipulating, services, and therefore impacting revenue for decades. I mean, and they've been laundering money that way. It's the systemic abuse of systems that I'm more concerned with rather than the big flash. We will respond, and bravely, when that happens. But the big fear is, I like the cyber Attila the Hun.
I kind of think that it has been going on, but I think that there has been a latency in the reporting of some of the things. As we know, people don't like to report that they've had breaches, they've had issues. And I think some of the recent ones where I remember when you'd hear about a breach and there'd be no impact to the company stock. And today, there's a rumor of a breach and the company stock is affected dramatically. And so I think that some of the things that are happening need to happen, like insurance companies are beginning to look at how do we underwrite this cyber issue.
In fact, there's legislation. Did you guys know that the banking industry now requires cyber insurance? It's must have. So there's a run on cyber insurance policies, and the actuarials in it are poorly thought out. It's interesting. If I talk to a defense industrial base practitioner, they would say, I don't see cybercrime. APTs. And if I talk to a bank, they're like, APTs? No, it's all cybercrime. In fact, banks could measure as early as 2004, 2005, and I used to work very closely with their security departments on this, to the number of basis points per service they saw in fraud. And it was acceptable to a bank was up to 2 basis points. That meant 1/10,000%. And that should put it in terms, most of them, that meant between $500,000 and $1 million of loss a month for a service. That was acceptable because it didn't impact their margins that much. Above that, they'd start to deploy security controls. So, and that's been going on forever. But you didn't hear about that in the press, right?
So I think that we're going to see a lot more corporate governance. We're talking to the insurance, the Risk Academy about, should there be a counterterrorism type of a law put in place for a catastrophic cyber event? How do they cap the cyber event? So this is a very complex area, and I think that
A hack of God, is that the?
yeah, exactly. What happens if all the airplanes crash? Is the government going to underwrite the maximum amount? So there's a lot of thought going around today about, and there needs to be more communication, more sharing of information, and I think people like Home Depot and Target and all these things that are happening are going to drive industry a lot more quickly than we've been driven over the last 10 years.
Grumman's been standing for a while now.
Hi, I'm Donald Steiner from Northrop Grumman. You guys just moved too fast, so I have 3 comments now. But, so one, backing up to Spaff and your car incident. So I just wanted to make the observation that, yes, there are always going to be times when the technology breaks or fails, and the question is, what is the net impact, right? So, okay, there might be a crash because of the car failing, but is it sort of worth it by having prevented all of the other myriads of crashes when the car was actually functioning
It's worth it to me.
Well, no, but wait, crash
Yeah.
statistics are horrific, right? There's over 200,000 crashes a year with fatalities in like 25% of them in the U.S. alone. I mean, it's staggering. And so do we get that down to 2,000 or 200? And,
Yeah, and so there's clearly a trade-off in how safe do you make it versus right now, and I'd be interested if anybody has any statistics on anti-lock brake systems, right? Because
Yes,
ABS, we really rely on ABS a lot, and do they actually ever break? Because that's essentially computer controlled.
So, it's interesting. I worked in the industry for a while on airbags for restraint control systems, and we recently joined the Automotive Safety Council because active safety systems are becoming largely a part of, future cars, and we thought that cyber would be an area and they're actually NISTA is putting cyber under the safety category. So I encourage folks, if you're interested in automobiles and control systems with automobiles, the Automotive Safety Council is something you should consider joining. But the data on ABS systems is surprisingly does not show that there has been a reduction in severity of crashes as a result of ABS. So that's one of the areas that, certainly airbags, active control systems. They're speculating that ABS may start to show improvement now that we have better active safety systems, but ABS on their own haven't. There's not a lot of.
it's also hard.
data.
It's also hard to quantify some of
Yeah,
it, right?
I
I mean,
get that.
little dings as opposed to big dings. Things. But-
There may be a human factor there that's interesting. There have been occasions where, particularly in North Carolina, where I would visit Research Triangle area, if they'd have an ice storm, the majority of vehicles that were off the road were four-wheel drive because people just thought that they would be able to handle it. And so with ABS, people may be less likely to drive and brake as carefully because they know it's
puddles
there.
they can ignore. And,
Then a second question I had, and you're starting to get into this, so maybe it was going to be a natural evolution, but as far as the insurance, and what are your thoughts about, has a company done all that it can to avoid an incident, right? There's sort of this due diligence versus negligence and so on. How is the insurance industry going to be able to quantify that? Because a lot of it is assigning blame.
Other than chicken entrails?
Well,
horoscopes is
it's not. It's not
So
just.
I can talk to that a little bit. We're working with Deloitte and some others, and we've developed a platform, a virtual platform in which we can do assessment, and there are auditing and so on. So when the insurance companies are starting to look at is a relatively comprehensive approach to start to look at, depending on your organization, the size, who's your threat, what's your threat vector, where it's coming from. Do you have the technologies in place to address that? Do you have to have an incident response team? Are they trained? So that's coming, and the insurance companies are going to be the customers. We're out talking to insurance companies now about participating with them. One of the products we provide is a training program, and we'd like them to basically go in and say, hey, if you use Cypris product or program, we'll lower your rates. So,
or if you have a serious graduate on staff.
right, or serious.
Yes.
But that's what they're looking at. Who's your staff? What are their qualifications, and so on. So that's all beginning to evolve, and that's probably going to be here in spades in the next several years.
I think this is an interesting question because, we went through it, and the DOD, we're going through it in the DOD side right now on the acquisition side, right? Folks are saying that you need to build cybersecurity into your products at the front end, and they said that you as contractors that are building these products, you need to make sure that these things are cyber secure, safe. So we turn around and say, okay, what kinds of things make them safe in your mind so that we build them into it? And it gets real quiet. And the same thing happens on the insurance side. Okay, I'm a regulated industry. I need to be cyber secure. I'm going to buy cyber security insurance. What checklist do I need to follow to make sure that I'm compliant? And if I do all these things, am I good? And as cybersecurity experts in this room, there is no checklist that will make you secure from all those threats. And so pretty soon you're spending lots of money on putting people and processes in place that maybe aren't making you any more secure, but raising the cost of your per unit cost of your product, maybe not for the better. And so I don't know how you answer that question because nobody's been able to tell me which product I put in place, which process, which training, which is actually going to secure me.
Well, the actuarial tables are a mess. I mean, it's insufficient data, and it's too sporadic.
And it evolves too quickly.
And it evolves too quickly. And I would advise anybody who's in a company that gets this sort of insurance to also get malpractice insurance. Right? And I'm not even joking because there will be finger-pointing and blame cast about when somebody comes to do an audit of this. And that will lead to an invasion of privacy as individuals on the job, right? They'll be monitoring your workstation, monitoring your keystrokes. It can be a slippery slope. The equation has to fundamentally change because, I used to, when I went to one of the two colleges that I went to, there were signs on the wall that said no singing and dancing. It was an old mill in Massachusetts. And that meant somebody used to sing and dance when they were working in the mill. People put signs up, they pass regulations to change behavior. So the reason you're seeing all this activity is because, frankly, the industry is getting tired of losses, and they're forcing the insurance companies into the game. It has a knock-on effect of forcing them, in fact, to start driving best practices. But when you're just responding to regs and you're just responding to audits, you're not actually improving the state of the art. You're getting into this rat race of bureaucracy and tail chasing. And I'm actually a little bit concerned by it. I think in moderation it can be a positive influence, but I'm very worried that it's going to lead to doing things for things' sake and to being very difficult to be a security practitioner right when we need the opposite.
Well, some of those regulations that have been set were set for days of mainframes with punch cards. And so they addressed problems that used to occur, and they're still being imposed currently, and that may actually make things worse.
And if you think of a time for somebody in a security department, in a well-run security department, time is the currency. And so every time you knock away at time, you're effectively forcing them to focus on the tool, and you're focusing them to worry about a process when they aren't actually practicing security and hunting bad guys and doing what they're supposed to do. Diligence is important, and constant change and constant improvement is important. And as soon as you pass a reg, you create a blind spot in the organization and you tie up time. So there needs to be some degree of oversight and regulation, but I really hope they get those actuarial tables right, and that frankly, the companies you mentioned earlier start to advise people on how to get ahead of it, how to get ahead and show that they're shoring up risk.
Well, one of the challenges in this whole area right now is there aren't adequate resources available in these companies to do these things. So one of the things we're starting to see is they're wanting to scale up the personnel that they have the skill sets because Deloitte and Touche and these folks who would do the kind of things you guys are suggesting don't have the folks that have the skills to go into those organizations at any scale.
Yeah.
And do them. So that's, I think, one of the things that we're starting to see them recognize that they have to address.
Well, that's good news for our students.
Yeah.
Let's take another question then.
Hi, Cami Vanier from Indiana University. You've touched on this a couple times, but I'm really interested in this problem of like consistent advice. Like one of the I work particularly with end users, and it's really hard. You know, someone calls me up like, "What do I do in this situation?" And I'm like, "Well, I've got a PhD in this, and I don't know." And this is from an end user perspective, this is a little bit easier, some of the advice, but you know, I've even had situations where, you know, we tell users to install antivirus, bad guys aren't doing antivirus anymore. We got the message through, and now we don't have the next message through, and it's really hard to keep that up. And then you also have the same problem with security engineers and all these other groups. We don't know what the correct thing to do, and the correct thing to do changes. And so I'm kind of interested to actually hear you guys talk particularly about that.
Yeah, I talked to somebody recently who works professionally in this space, and he said he's spending about a third of his time going to conferences and tutorials and things trying to keep up with current trends. And I didn't know whether that meant that there's too much going on or he's incompetent at absorbing information. So what are your experiences in this area?
I think this gets back a little bit to what we were just talking about. You eventually end up in this place where you've got the haves and the have-nots, right? The companies that can afford to train their folks, to put the tools in place and the processes in place, and those tend to be the bigger companies. It's, you know, how do you solve that same problem with a lot of these smaller businesses where the guy that's running the company is the IT guy and he's also the CFO, you know, and that's a definite challenge. And, you know, from my perspective, it really has to start with just basic training. I look at my kids.
Yeah, well, we have some people out here, for instance, who work for the campus IT security, and you've got people in the dorms who are literature majors, and they have this question. They may not even know they have this question. How do we respond to them in any reasonable way?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one answer. I think you have to look at each population set, and there's probably some slightly different strategies. In the corporate world, it's a good idea to have an advisory body that you can pull, and not to use the classic tools, but to actually have you go to the tools. For instance, we use a lot of chat tools. We use a lot of message boards in the company, but other companies are different. Go to those tools with sane advice, or have forums, public forums, where people can ask those questions. In my personal family, I'm like the IT guy, right? So as soon as my father-in-law has a problem, I dread it, right? My phone rings, and I know it's, so this is being recorded, sorry, Dutch, but he's always got questions about should he do something or shouldn't he, and he knows. The spidey sense goes off, and he knows something's off. We had an interesting conversation at the break about password keepers. I pulled when I was at RSA, and so no slam on RSA on anybody, but I used to be the chief architect for the company, and I had all the identity architects in the room, and I said, so what do you guys do about passwords? And 6 of them said they had a file on their computer or a sticky pad, or, I mean, we're talking the people who should know better, right? I bet if we pulled this audience, it would be similar. So we chose a password keeper, and then I went to a conference soon after, and I don't attend very many, and somebody went up on stage and was pounding about you should not use a password keeper, should not. So what's the right thing to do? I use one, but I chose one that doesn't do password stuffing because it actually forces me when I need a password to open it, get it, read it, and by then I'm like, wait a minute, should I be doing this? So I don't think there's quick advice here, and it is a problem. It's a symptom of this, that the bad guys, by the way, are trying to constantly assess how we adapt and adapt it to us. So we've got to be treating this as a sustainable thing in communities.
If I understood your question, I think that I agree. Training's a big thing. You know, we have this thought process. The old paradigm is this idea of cybersecurity as a bolt-on to IT. You know, and it's not. It has to be an integrated part of what you do on a day-to-day basis, and you have to have the training to understand the systems, the architecture, and recognize when certain things are present and when it's time to do something about it. And so one of the things that you know, our company, we're providing incident response training now for the nation state of Singapore as an example, and our theme is take cybersecurity from an individual to a team sport. And the idea is this concept of, in a team, Well, you have to understand your role and you have to be good at what you do. You also have to understand under certain scenarios what the game book looks like and what the plays are that we're going to have to run, because in that environment, it's not the day-to-day environment. We all have to work together. So I think that organizations, whether you're big or small, have to start to think about how to make cyber an integral part of what, and it's not just IT. It's management, it's everybody that's got to be involved to understand what the issue is that we're addressing and how do we do it in a timely fashion. So
That's a good point. We ran a program for a while where we introduced the notion of a bounty if you found an attack. So if you thought you were being phished, you could send it, and then we paid people when they really found them, and then we announced to the company that they were on a list of people who had saved the company from something bad happening. And that was announced at all hands meetings. And so these people actually stopped attacks against the companies, and they were all applauded and things like that. So it wasn't just beating the ones who did it wrong, it was rewarding the ones who did it well visibly, too.
So I've got a quick funny story about that. So the Army went down this path about 7 years ago, and they decided they were going to do a phishing exercise with the Army. And they were going to send out a phishing email, and they were going to keep track of the statistics of who went to the site so they could use it as a training venue, right? And so they used the Army Outdoor Recreation website. So they sent out, I don't remember what it was thousands of these phishing emails to Army folks. And they kept track of everybody that went after them. And you know, as we expect, roughly 80% of the people who clicked on the link they weren't supposed to. And so they claimed victory. The problem was nobody would go to the Army Outdoor Rec site then for the next year because they all thought they were getting phished. So be careful what you ask for. You may learn some negative things.
So I want to go back a little bit more directly to the scenario you presented, the question you presented. And I think part of it has to do with the maturity of the field. Effectively, what we have is we have a lot of people coming up to the village elder and saying, I've got a fever, what do I do? And some say, well, eat 3 of these berries and drink a lot of water. Another one says, bury a fish under a pine tree at the next full moon. And the third one is, leave the village, leave us alone. Because none of those, first of all, we don't understand the underlying context to be able to say, well, what have you been eating recently? Is anybody else in your family have this problem? We don't understand cause and effect. We don't really have a firm foundation for a lot of what we do because everything is kind of one-off. So it's an uncomfortable time that we're trying to change. That doesn't give you an answer. You can't. But for some people, if you tell them, go bury a fish under a pine tree at a full moon, they'll hang up and be happy. That's just the way of the world at the moment. Rob?
Yeah, I had a question dealing with the Sony cyber attack, and I have some questions for the panelists from industry. One of the big worries, I think, from the U.S. government is simply how do we share information with industry when an incident like the Sony cyber attack happens before, during, and after. And so the U.S. government is very worried about when bilateral tensions are happening between the United States and a foreign country, how do we protect civilian infrastructure and industry? Mm-hmm. So what would, I guess I have a couple questions. What is your engagement with the U.S. government on these issues? Is this something brought up in industry? Are you worried about foreign countries doing things like the Sony cyber attack? If you could speak to that, mm-hmm. and if that's part of your defense plans.
Sure. I mean, in 2000, I was part of the Air Force, and we had an issue with one of the Air Force weapon systems, and it forced the Secretary of the Air Force to take a step back and say, how do we, Air Force, interact with some of these big defense contractors to make sure that, one, they know what we know when it comes to security threats, and two, that they're actually doing something about it. And I will tell you, so I got sent to my first meeting for that, and I thought I was going to meet with the IT side of the house. And when I sat down, I was meeting with the general counsel. That's where the conversation starts, right? And it goes back to what was said earlier, because those kinds of conversations impact share price, right? And that's the government side of it. I will tell you now on the defense contractor side, knowing what I knew on the government side is the government's going to have to learn how to share if they want the rest of us to play. They have a lot of good information there. I know you've had a chance to see it firsthand, but they're very unwilling to share it. And then if you share it, who gets to see it and who doesn't? Does a U.S.-only company get to see it, not an international company? Does a big company, not a small business? Is it the healthcare? the financial but not the defense industry. You know, you're hitting on a really interesting topic, and we have not figured it out yet because not everybody's willing to share. And it's definitely a team sport because my guess is if you talk to most of the people from industry here, there's a lot of conversations, backroom conversations going on between CISOs, CIO from companies that in the past never communicated that are now sharing threat vector information with one another, even though they compete with each other on the playing field. That's where this is driving to. Industry is rapidly getting really smart on cybersecurity. The government has yet been willing to kind of let the curtain down and have those same conversations with us. It tends to be very one way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
I was going
go
to
ahead.
mention the DIB, right? I mean,
Yeah, the DIB.
I mean, the DIB is so the government does have a process called the DIB. It's an by invitation only process to bring companies together and share information relating to various classified threats, and
But it's a closed community.
but it's a close community.
So first of all, I'd say when you cite something with a brand, Sony, Target, Home Depot, et cetera, be very leery of all the information sources you have on it. Most of those stories have to go to press very quickly. And the sources, even within a company, will have different stories about what actually happened. So these are examples best examined with the safety of history. So let time pass, take multiple sources. I used to do a lot of work with telco media entertainment. That's the vertical that does TV and movies and things. They used to tell me they were like a sieve, that they leaked films, and it wasn't a question of if, it was when, because they had this very clear cycle of when they made money on movies and on ads and on TV shows. And the goal of the Information Security Department was to keep this from leaking for a period of a week to 2 weeks, depending on where in the information cycle they were. So the notion of losing a movie is not new, right? It's who the attacker was and the politics that were around it, which gets to the question of information sharing. One of the best examples I can think of is the FSISAC. They do a really good job of sharing information. And I think I did this here. I once drew an analogy to bees, right? So bees have evolved. When they sting, they die. It's a strange thing to evolve, right? Or that you would die. Why does it happen? It has to do with being part of a community. To stop a threat, bees, their life isn't worth as much as the continuation of the hive is for the passing on of their DNA. We don't want to be the bee, of course, but being part of a community, after a certain point, you get more benefit from being a part of the community than you do by standing outside. And the FSISAC has passed that tipping point to the point where non-financial services institutions are beginning to share information with them, and non-US financial service institutions are now taking part. The community is so good at information sharing. They've also become a template for other ISACs, so the retail ISAC is looking to do that as well. So there's the government ones, which typically are closed communities of interest. They require classified access. They can be very difficult to take action in some cases because the information is, in fact, privileged that you might be taking action on. And then there's the FSISAC and the other ISACs that are starting to build up new communities. And then now the question becomes, how do you share more relevant data? And how do you avoid getting an opponent inside your information sharing loop? Because if you're actually sharing data, you give a early warning sign to attackers that you have telemetry on them, IOCs and TTPs, and they change their behavior. So acting on the system affects the system. It's a form of uncertainty principle. So we do need to do some advances in how to share information efficiently, remove redundancy, and how to avoid providing feedback loops to the bad guys. Because in many cases, we may start seeing their financial services institutions joining the FSISAC, and boom, you've got a feedback loop right into them.
Well, I think there are two characteristics that in this situation, if we get to the point of having these be matter-of-fact known approaches, we've made progress. The first is where you have a large multinational corporation that's operating in multiple countries, and the governments of all of those countries are willing to share with the management what they know, and know that all those countries are sharing the information.
And they have cleared people with each country.
And they have a way to do that, and it doesn't make a big difference. And the other is where we have companies that, just use the US example, headquartered or at least derived from other country corporations that have the same access without concern. And an example that comes to mind as a random example, Huawei USA.
Or Huawei Canada. They're now a government contractor.
Yeah, and so they're in a position, they're supplying critical infrastructure goods and services. If there's a threat against them that may be coming from the country of origin, do we not share anything with them, and therefore it's a competitive disadvantage and a disservice to their customers, or otherwise? These are questions that are going to have to be worked out as common cases. If all we do is think U.S. companies, U.S. government protecting U.S. companies, we're going to lose.
The reverse exists, by the way, when U.S. companies go to other countries. So if you have an office in Germany, who've recently become very sensitive to anything NSA related, or in France, or in parts of Asia, the exact same issue exists. So we're talking about creating structures that maybe they don't supersede, but they transcend national boundaries. And what the new normal is has to be worked out.
Well, isn't this actually a characteristic of what the internet and sort of democratization of communication is bringing about? That I won't say it's making governments secondary, but the boundaries are no longer as visible.
Well,
so
the internet,
do?
it's a wonderful thing in the critical mass that it has, but it isn't for granted that it will continue that way. I mean, we still have things like the Great Firewall. You still have the ability for some countries to cut themselves off, although obviously at staggering cost. And there's continual debate about new types of services that will be carried that don't maintain some of those principles. So I think it's an interesting thing to watch play out, but it's fantastic how the internet has grown to be, and it's a good case study by itself.
Anybody else on that? So I had a thought occur earlier. We don't have somebody at the mic, but let me use this as a sort of concluding question here. And this, again, goes back to the idea of de-skilling to some extent. As background, there's something that not everybody is familiar with the phrase. It's called a Carrington event. And it was named after Lord Carrington, who studied and published this. It was in the 1800s, well before an internet, but there were long-term telegraph connections and so on. It was a massive solar flare that resulted in, effectively, an EMP pulse for the whole Earth. Telegraph lines melted. Gas pipelines blew up because the induced current ignited the gas. And very limited infrastructure at the time. There wasn't much in the way of generators or the internet. But very significant. And we recently had something similar to that, not anywhere near as strong. The Northern Light example of last week. Northern Lights were seen all the way into the southern part of the Northern Hemisphere. These are unpredictable, and they're somewhat at random. But if something like that were to occur, it would destroy large parts of our infrastructure. It's that would be a kind of a global event, but those kind of things could also be triggered by terrorist or military activities or criminal activities, or simply by accident.
Big blackout.
Somebody throws the wrong switch, a tree branch falls on a power line. How prepared are we by focusing on the attack per machine or per network for dealing with larger catastrophic kinds of problems?
You know, I think from my perspective, the thing that I think we lack is being able to associate the mission that the network and the infrastructure are supporting to the actual indicators that are out there. And you know, we had an incident inside the Air Force where somebody went out with a backhoe and dug a big hole where they weren't supposed to, and it brought down a large portion of the Air Force network. And so the first question that was asked is, you know, who did it? And the next question was, well, what did we just lose? And one of the things that most people learn, particularly inside companies, are there isn't really anybody inside of most companies that really know what lives where on their network. Mm-hmm. And most of the stuff is no longer on your network anymore. It's out there in that cloud, in that ether somewhere. And so one of the challenges today for companies is to really understand, you know, how their missions rely on that infrastructure and what the impact to their mission really is.
About 20 years ago, a researcher by the name of Brian Reed, who used to be at Deck Western, said that distributed computing is when a machine you never heard of in a place you didn't know existed went down and you can't do your work. And that's very much like cloud computing now. Do either of you gentlemen have?
Yeah, I had a comment. I think that
We need your mic there.
again, it gets down, I think, to what you said, understanding what part of our architecture has gone down, what are our priorities, and having the awareness to deal with that situation in real time, right? Because You know, you could have a macro event, but still we have to have, individual organizations have to respond. And they have to respond jointly, and they have to have, you know, the ability to communicate, share information, and do that in real time.
So there's a hotel group, IHG, who used to routinely practice turning all power off, making sure business could continue. I'm not suggesting that companies can do that, especially not if they use the cloud to a large extent, but there is and should be risk mandates within the company that should be asking these sorts of questions and testing and trialing and putting redundancy in place. I don't know if we can handle all power loss or multiple nuclear bombs or that kind of event, but it is up to the risk office to do it, and IT risk is subordinate to that. IT risk and managing it can help us build some robustness and redundancy into the system, but it is bigger than just IT.
But it is part of our, you know, disaster recovery plan process, right?
And you constantly have to be challenging those people to think bigger and start looking at the long tail of highly unlikely but would be really bad.
I think security could learn from that, and we haven't.
Yeah.
And that was part of the message here is, yeah, if we know how to recover from something like that, we should be able to do the same in a cyber. We actually have time for one last question, and Ralph is at the microphone, so.
Hi, I'm Ralph Poor. I had a question you were getting into to some extent in that information security really needs to be infrastructural, and that infrastructure is something that should be built to last, like the pyramids or the Hoover Dam. They're not, it shouldn't be something that is fragile and something that is constantly a patchwork. Given that, but also given that we live in technology that changes very rapidly, and where the test bed for most commercial applications is the user community at large, there doesn't seem to be that much of an emphasis on information security being infrastructural, that is built to last, where it is taken as a serious component that needs to underlie everything in order for these other things to have the reliability necessary to serve us, not just in the disaster recovery kinds of scenarios, which may be unpredictable, but just in general. We find an awful lot of security things that are designed to fail. That is, that the security aspect of it architecturally was not well thought out, and it was then put out to be relied upon when, had any of your graduates actually been involved in reviewing it, they would have known immediately that it was not built to last. So just something to talk about.
There's an element, as you were talking, I was thinking that perhaps part of this is a failure of our success, in that anyone can go down to a store or go online and buy a computer and a router and just plug it in and turn it on. We don't view that as infrastructure. Whereas if we want to wire a building or put in plumbing, we can't easily go out and order transformers. We can't go and get all the piping and do it. Some people can, and they do it badly.
So I'd love to comment here. If you want to start a company, you can have email, a server farm, storage, all of it within about 2 hours, right? You can just get it all. Should you? I don't know. You guys remember the Orange Book? Do you remember how long those certifications take?
Yeah.
Right? Do you remember what a STU modem was? Right? Do you remember how rapidly they became redundant? Because the throughput on those things was doubling at one point at like every 6 or 7 months. RSA at one point kind of amusingly got into the modem market, and they brought a 4800 BPS modem to market when 14.4 hit the streets. I mean, it was, so this notion of the longer you take to do the security and the faster things are changing, the less likely you are to succeed at doing so. So that came to mind when you were speaking. It was, I'd love to get it right in the infrastructure, but in some ways, unfortunately, the perfect is the enemy of the good, in the sense that if we could solve the infrastructure problems, it would be wonderful, but we're living in an age of almost guaranteed infrastructure failure. So the question becomes, and I love these movies where someone's typing and they're the hacker in the movie and they hit enter and they go, I'm done. You know, because it doesn't happen that fast, right? It takes a long time. So we're now in a situation where time is the currency again, And it's about what processes you have in place after you put the walls and the barricades up and get the infrastructure to catch the ones that get through. Obviously, reduce that as much as possible, but work on the assumption some will. So instead of making it perfect, continually make it better, and then really focus resources on what gets through and dealing with that. I visited the Oosterschelde in Holland, and they have these dams. They had terrible floods in the 50s, and they used to just make bigger dams and bigger dams until they realized that just stopping the water made it worse. It was how they channeled the water that got through that became most effective. And if you've ever seen these things, they're fantastic. They go for miles, and they move them up and down to control with the wave patterns to have almost no damage inland in Zeeland, in southern Holland. It's that kind of approach to security that's more important than getting the infrastructure perfect. I think we got to continually improve it, but we got to deal with the after effects as part of our processes.
I'd argue that is infrastructure. Your example
Okay,
is
then
architectural design to deal with that change.
right.
I don't see that happening.
That is the challenge before us, and I think there are some who are more mature. Probably 5 to 10% of companies and government organizations is a little higher, are in the highest category. And by the way, in terms of companies, it's probably 30, 40% are at the worst and higher in government, right? They have less in the middle. They've got these two extremes. But we've got to get as many up that curve as possible.
You know, it used to be a time when companies owned their own infrastructure and they were responsible for their own infrastructure. Those days are gone. And so the onus is now going to be on you folks. You're going to find yourselves in a different situation here. You're going to be sitting down with Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and you're going to be spending time reading the terms and conditions of the license that you're about to sign to understand what risk you're taking on by telling the owner of the company that we ought to sign up with this company X.
And what risks you're assuming for your customers.
But, you know, and
Just
so
by default.
you're now outsourcing your security, and a lot of companies are saying, I just outsourced it to Google, it's Google's problem. And companies are not digging into the fine print to understand what Google's taking on and what you're assuming. And that's going to become real important here because most people don't realize the vulnerability that they're opening their customers and their companies up to.
So you're recommending a law degree as a dual degree path? Or
I'm
Almost like
recommending
a
that
coroner.
You know, the days of tribes, security tribes and legal tribes, those days are over. Those streams have crossed. And you're going to have, I used to tell folks when we built payloads for the offensive side, you know, you're going to have the engineer here, the operator, the guy that's going to use it here, and the lawyer sitting next to him, because it's going to take all three of those to negotiate who can do what.
That's combined arms.
We know from Ghostbusters what happens when you cross the streams.
That's right. Bad things happen.
So, please join me in thanking the panel for their insights.